The teacup slipped from Alina's hand before she could stop it, and the warm liquid spread across the front of her mother's old dress like a dark cloud swallowing the moon. She stood frozen, staring at the stain as it soaked deeper into the pale fabric, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Behind her, the door creaked open, and her stepsister Beatrice stepped inside, already smiling the smile she wore whenever something was about to go wrong for Alina. "What did you do now?" Beatrice asked, though her tone carried no real question in it. She already knew, and she already found it delightful. Alina pressed her hand against the wet mark, as if she could push it back out of the cloth. "It was an accident," she said quietly. "I only wanted a cup of tea to calm my nerves before tonight." "Well, your nerves have ruined the only decent dress you own." Beatrice folded her arms and leaned against the doorframe, watching Alina the way a cat watches something small and helpless. "You cannot go to the palace like that. Everyone will see it. Everyone will laugh." Alina's throat tightened, but she refused to let the tears come. Crying in front of Beatrice would only make the evening worse, and there was no time to waste on tears. The carriage that Mrs. Whitfield had arranged would arrive within the hour, and if Alina missed it, she would lose the only chance she had ever been given to step outside the narrow, gray walls of the house she had lived in since her mother died. She had not expected an invitation. No one in the town expected a girl like Alina Whitmore to receive one. Her father, Edmund, had married again after her mother passed, hoping to give Alina a family, but the woman he chose came with 2 daughters who saw Alina not as a sister, but as a servant they had not asked for. Edmund had passed away 2 years later, and since then, Alina's stepmother made no effort to hide how she truly felt. Alina cooked, cleaned, mended clothes, and asked for nothing in return, because asking only invited punishment. The invitation had come through Mrs. Whitfield, an old friend of her mother's who still lived on the edge of town, and still remembered the woman Alina's mother had been before illness took her. Mrs. Whitfield had a niece who worked within the palace kitchens, and through a string of small favors and old friendships, a single invitation had found its way into Alina's hands. It was not a formal invitation meant specifically for her. It was a spare card, one among many printed for the kingdom's most important families, and Mrs. Whitfield had insisted that Alina use it. "You deserve one night," Mrs. Whitfield had told her, pressing the card into her palm with both hands. "One night where no one tells you what you are allowed to want." Alina had held onto those words for 3 days, turning them over in her mind while she scrubbed floors and mended torn hems for her stepsisters. She had not told her stepmother about the invitation until it was impossible to hide, because she knew what would happen the moment the woman found out. And she had been right. Her stepmother, upon hearing the news, had laughed the kind of laugh that held no warmth in it at all. "You at the palace ball," she had said, looking Alina up and down as though inspecting a stray animal that had wandered into her kitchen. "What will you wear, girl? Sackcloth." "I have my mother's dress," Alina had answered, keeping her voice steady though her hands trembled at her sides. "That old thing," her stepmother had waved a hand dismissively. "Wear it if you must. It will only prove to everyone what kind of family you truly come from." That conversation had happened 3 days ago, and now, with the stain spreading across the fabric and Beatrice laughing softly in the doorway, Alina wondered if her stepmother had been right all along. Perhaps she was not meant for places like the palace. Perhaps the world had already decided, long before she was born, what kind of life she was allowed to have. But then she thought of her mother, and the way her mother used to hum quietly while braiding Alina's hair before bed, telling her that kindness was worth more than any title, and that a person's worth was never measured by the clothes on their back. Her mother had believed that with her whole heart, even when life gave her every reason to believe otherwise. Alina straightened her shoulders and looked at the stain again, this time without flinching. "I am still going," she said. Beatrice's smile faltered for just a moment, surprised by the steadiness in Alina's voice. "You cannot be serious. Look at yourself." "I am looking," Alina said, "and I see a dress that belonged to my mother and I see myself wearing it. That is enough for me." She moved past Beatrice toward the small mirror hanging crookedly on the wall, and began searching through the wooden chest at the foot of her bed for anything that might help hide the mark. She found a thin shawl, faded with age but still soft, and wrapped it carefully around her shoulders and across her chest, arranging the fabric until the stain disappeared beneath the folds. It was not a perfect solution, but it would have to be enough. Downstairs, she could hear her other stepsister, Priya, calling out in excitement as she admired her own reflection in a grander mirror, one that had once belonged to Alina's mother before it was claimed by the new lady of the house. Priya's dress was a deep shade of blue, embroidered with silver thread that caught the candlelight whenever she moved. Beatrice's gown was a rich burgundy, tailored to fit her perfectly, with small pearls sewn along the collar. Alina did not resent them for their fine clothes. She had long ago stopped comparing herself to things she could not have. What she wanted was simpler than fine fabric or silver thread. She wanted, just once, to walk through a door without being told she did not belong on the other side of it. The carriage arrived precisely when Mrs. Whitfield had promised it would, a modest but respectable vehicle sent by a distant cousin who owed Mrs. Whitfield a favor. Alina's stepmother watched from the window as Alina climbed inside, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval, though she said nothing more. Priya and Beatrice had already left in a finer carriage 20 minutes earlier, eager to arrive while the evening was still fresh, and the important guests had not yet grown tired of introductions. As the carriage rattled along the road toward the palace, Alina watched the passing fields through the small window, her fingers gripping the edge of the shawl. She tried to calm the storm of nerves building inside her chest, reminding herself that she was not going to the ball to be noticed. She was going because Mrs. Whitfield believed she deserved one evening of beauty and music and light, after years of quiet grief and endless work. She would stay near the edges of the room, admire the grandeur from a respectful distance, and return home before anyone thought to question who she was or why she had come. That was the plan, simple and safe. She held on to it like a lifeline as the palace gates came into view, tall and gleaming under the light of 100 lanterns. And for a moment, despite everything, despite the stain hidden beneath her shawl and the sharp words still echoing in her mind, Alina allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope, small and fragile but real. The carriage came to a stop, and a footman in a crisp uniform opened the door, offering his hand to help her step down onto the stone path. Alina took a breath, smoothed the shawl one final time, and stepped out into the golden light spilling from the palace windows. Ahead of her, laughter and music drifted through the open doors, and beyond them, though she did not yet know it, stood a night that would change the course of her entire life. She walked toward the entrance with her chin held high, refusing to let her nerves show on her face. Guards in polished armor stood at either side of the grand doorway, and beyond them she could see glimpses of chandeliers glittering like captured stars, of gowns in every color imaginable swirling across a marble floor. It was more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined, and for a brief, shining moment, Alina forgot about the stain entirely. She forgot about it, that is, until she reached the top of the stairs, where a sudden gust of wind swept through the open doors and pulled at the edges of her shawl, loosening it from where she had so carefully arranged it. She reached quickly to fix it, but it was too late. The fabric slipped just enough, just long enough, for the dark mark on her mother's dress to catch the light of the chandeliers above. A cluster of guests standing near the entrance turned at the sound of rustling fabric, their eyes drawn instinctively to the movement. Alina felt the weight of their attention before she even understood what had happened, a prickling awareness crawling up the back of her neck. She reached for the shawl again, trying to pull it back into place with steady hands, but the damage, small as it was, had already been noticed. A young woman in emerald silk leaned toward her companion, whispering something behind a gloved hand. The companion glanced at Alina, then quickly looked away, though not quickly enough to hide the flicker of amusement crossing her face. Alina kept walking, refusing to slow her pace, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of watching her falter at the very threshold of the palace. She told herself it was nothing, a shadow, perhaps, or a trick of the candlelight. No one could truly see a small stain from such a distance, not in a hall filled with hundreds of guests and thousands of dancing lights. She was wrong, and she would learn just how wrong within the hour. But for now, she pressed forward into the grand hall, letting the music and the warmth of the crowded room wash over her like a wave. Somewhere above the sea of guests, a lone figure had paused near one of the tall marble columns, his attention caught not by the mark on her dress, but by the quiet dignity with which she carried herself through a room full of strangers, chin lifted, shoulders straight, as though she had walked into far grander places than this one and had nothing left to prove to anyone. He did not yet know her name, but he found quite suddenly that he wanted to. The whisper traveled faster than Alina could have imagined possible. By the time she reached the far side of the hall, where a long table held crystal glasses of sparkling drink, the word had already begun to spread from guest to guest like a spark catching dry grass. She noticed the change in the air before she understood its cause, a subtle shift in the way people glanced at her and then quickly turned away, the way conversations dipped into lower tones whenever she passed. It was Priya who finally said it aloud, loud enough for a dozen ears to catch. Alina's stepsister stood near a group of young noblewomen, her blue gown catching the light beautifully as she gestured toward Alina with a delicate, mocking motion of her fan. "Do you see that?" Priya said, her voice pitched just enough to carry. "On her dress. I believe that is tea." The noblewomen turned, and this time there was no pretending not to see. Alina felt her face grow warm as dozens of eyes settled on her at once, and though she tried to pull the shawl higher, the fabric had already slipped too far, and lifting it now would only draw more attention to the very thing she was trying to hide. Beatrice appeared beside Priya a moment later, her burgundy gown swishing dramatically as she pressed a hand to her chest in mock horror. "Oh, how unfortunate," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I did tell her not to come. I said, surely you have something better to wear than mother's old rags, but she insisted. Some people simply cannot be told." A ripple of laughter spread through the small crowd gathered near the table, and Alina felt each note of it land against her like a small, sharp stone. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the marble floor and vanish from the hall entirely, but she forced herself to remain standing exactly where she was. Running would only prove them right. Running would tell every person in that hall that she believed, deep down, that she truly did not belong among them. "It is only a stain," Alina said, keeping her voice as level as she could manage, though it trembled slightly at the edges. "It happened by accident. I did not think it worth staying home over." "Of course you didn't," said a young man standing near Beatrice, his tone light and cruel in the careless way of someone who had never once been made to feel small. "Why would anyone let a little thing like appropriate dress stop them from attending a royal ball?" More laughter followed, and Alina felt her composure beginning to crack at the edges, like ice under too much weight. She thought of turning back toward the entrance, of finding the carriage and asking to be taken home before the evening grew any worse, but something in her refused to move. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was the memory of her mother's voice, gentle but firm, telling her that a person's dignity was never something others could take from them unless they allowed it. Whatever the reason, Alina stood her ground, even as the whispers multiplied and the laughter grew louder, even as strangers she had never met began forming opinions about her worth based on nothing more than a small mark of dried tea. "Perhaps," said a new voice, calm and clear and carrying an unmistakable note of authority, "you should all look more closely before deciding what you are laughing at." The crowd fell silent almost instantly, heads turning toward the sound. Alina turned as well and found herself looking directly into the eyes of a young man she recognized at once, though she had never before seen him in person. Portraits of him hung in the town hall and appeared on coins passed from hand to hand throughout the kingdom. Prince Adrian stood only a few steps away, dressed in deep navy and silver, his expression unreadable as he studied the small gathering with an intensity that made even Beatrice's confident smile falter. "Your Highness," Beatrice said quickly, dropping into a hurried curtsy, her face flushing pink. Priya followed a beat behind her, and the rest of the group scrambled to do the same, the laughter dying away as quickly as it had begun. Prince Adrian did not acknowledge their curtsies right away. Instead, his gaze moved to Alina, taking in the shawl slipping from her shoulders, the faded fabric of her dress, and the small dark mark that had caused so much amusement only moments before. Alina felt her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone around her could hear it, certain that whatever came next would only deepen her humiliation. "May I ask your name?" the prince said, and though his voice was gentle, it carried easily across the now quiet space around them. "Alina," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alina Whitmore, your highness." "Alina Whitmore," he repeated, as though testing the shape of the name in his mouth. Then he turned slowly to face the small crowd that had gathered to mock her only minutes earlier, and something in his expression shifted, becoming sharper, more deliberate. "I must say, I am surprised by what I am hearing. I had thought this gathering was filled with people of taste and refinement. Instead, I find a group mocking a guest for wearing what may very well be the most interesting dress in the entire hall tonight." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. Beatrice's mouth opened slightly, as though she wanted to protest but could not find the words. Priya glanced nervously at the prince, then at Alina, clearly trying to understand what she had missed. "Forgive me, your highness," Beatrice managed finally, her voice noticeably less confident than before, "but I do not understand. It is only a stain." "A stain," the prince repeated, as though considering the word carefully. He stepped closer to Alina, close enough that she could see the genuine curiosity in his expression, and reached out, not touching her, but gesturing toward the mark on her dress with an open palm, inviting the crowd to look again. "Or perhaps," he continued, his voice carrying easily now, drawing the attention of guests further away who had begun to notice the unusual scene unfolding near the refreshment table, "perhaps what you are looking at is something entirely different. I have recently returned from a journey through the eastern provinces, where I saw fabric dyed in exactly this manner, a deliberate blending of colors meant to mimic the shifting light of dusk. It is considered quite rare there, and quite expensive." Alina stared at him, too stunned to speak. She knew, of course, that there was no eastern province, no rare dye, no deliberate technique behind the mark on her dress. It was tea, spilled by accident in a moment of nervous clumsiness less than 2 hours earlier. But something in the prince's steady gaze told her not to correct him, not yet, not in front of a crowd already reconsidering everything they thought they understood about the girl standing before them. "I did not realize," Beatrice said slowly, glancing down at Alina's dress with newly uncertain eyes, "that such a fashion existed." "Few in this kingdom have seen it," the prince said smoothly. "Which is precisely what makes it remarkable that Miss Whitmore arrived wearing it this evening, ahead of every noble family in this hall." The transformation in the crowd's expression was almost immediate and almost comical in its speed. The same young man who had mocked Alina moments before now leaned forward slightly, studying the mark on her dress with obvious reassessment. Priya's eyes widened, flickering between Alina and the prince, calculating something Alina could not quite read. Beatrice, for her part, looked as though she had swallowed something unpleasant, her earlier confidence replaced by a stiff, uncertain smile. "How fascinating," said the young noblewoman in emerald silk, the same one who had whispered behind her gloved hand earlier. She stepped closer now, studying Alina's dress with open admiration rather than mockery. "I had heard rumors of new styles emerging from the east, but I had no idea they had already reached our shores." Alina remained silent, her mind racing to keep pace with everything happening around her. Only minutes ago, she had been the subject of ridicule, certain that the evening would end in humiliation and an early return home. Now, impossibly, the very thing that had caused her shame was being praised, admired, even envied by the same people who had laughed at her only moments before. She did not fully understand what had just happened, or why the prince had chosen to intervene on her behalf, but she felt a fragile warmth spreading through her chest, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Your Highness," she said quietly, once the small crowd had begun to disperse, murmuring excitedly among themselves about this supposed new fashion from distant lands, "I do not know how to thank you." Prince Adrian studied her for a long moment, and something softened in his expression, the formal authority he had shown moments before giving way to something more genuine, more curious. "There is no need for thanks," he said. "I simply do not care for cruelty, especially when it targets those who have done nothing to deserve it. Though I confess, I am curious about the true story behind your dress, if you are willing to share it." Alina hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one stood close enough to overhear. "It is not nearly as exciting as the story you told them," she admitted, a small, nervous smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I spilled tea on myself while trying to calm my nerves before coming here tonight." To her surprise, the prince laughed, a genuine, warm sound that seemed to catch even him slightly off guard. "That," he said, "is a far better story than the one I invented. Perhaps someday you might allow me to hear the rest of it." Alina felt her cheeks flush warm, though this time it was not from embarrassment. Around them, the ball continued, music swelling and guests swirling across the marble floor in bright circles of silk and laughter. But for a moment, standing beside the prince near the refreshment table, Alina felt as though the entire world had narrowed down to this single conversation. Fragile and unexpected, and entirely unlike anything she had known before. Across the room, Beatrice pulled Priya aside, her fingers digging into her sister's arm with enough force to draw a small wince. "Did you see that?" she hissed, glancing back toward the prince and Alina, who were still speaking quietly near the table. "He spoke to her as though she were someone important. As though she belonged here more than we do." "It is only a stain," Priya whispered back, though her voice lacked its earlier certainty. "He must have simply been being polite. Princes are always polite to strays who wander in uninvited." But even as she said it, Priya could not stop glancing across the hall, watching the way other guests had begun drifting closer to Alina, drawn by curiosity now rather than mockery. It unsettled her in a way she did not have words for, a small, cold feeling settling low in her stomach, the kind that whispered quietly that something in the natural order of things had shifted, even if she could not yet say exactly what. Their stepmother, seated near the far wall among a group of older women exchanging polite gossip, had also witnessed the scene, though from too great a distance to hear the words exchanged. She had seen only the shape of it, her stepdaughter, dressed in an old, faded gown, standing close to the prince while he spoke to her with obvious interest, while her own daughters stood several steps away, momentarily forgotten. The sight left a bitter taste in her mouth, though she said nothing, choosing instead to watch and wait, certain that whatever strange favor Alina had stumbled into would not last the night. Alina, unaware of the calculations happening around her, focused only on the conversation in front of her, on the surprising ease with which the prince spoke to her, as though she were simply another guest and not a girl who cleaned floors and mended hems for a family that resented her presence in their home. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her with genuine curiosity, rather than obligation or disdain, that she almost did not know how to respond to it. "You seem surprised that I would want to speak with you," the prince observed, watching her expression carefully. "I am not accustomed to it," Alina admitted honestly, deciding there was little point in pretending otherwise. "Most people in my life prefer that I remain quiet and out of sight." Something flickered across his face at that, though he did not press her further, sensing perhaps that the full story behind those words was not one she was ready to share with a stranger, however kind he had proven himself to be in the last quarter hour. Instead, he offered his arm, the gesture simple but deliberate. "Then perhaps," he said, "you might allow me the honor of the next dance, and we can discuss whatever subjects you find more comfortable than silence." Alina looked at his offered arm, then at the sea of guests still watching them from a careful distance, whispering behind fans and gloved hands. She thought of her stepmother's warning that morning, of Beatrice's laughter in the doorway, of the stain still hidden beneath her shawl that had somehow, through the prince's quick thinking, become the very thing drawing admiration rather than scorn. None of it made complete sense to her yet, but she found, standing there in the golden light of 100 chandeliers, that she no longer wished to retreat toward the shadows at the edge of the hall. She placed her hand gently on his arm. "I would like that very much, Your Highness." The moment they stepped onto the dance floor, Alina felt every eye in the room shift toward them, an invisible weight pressing against her shoulders. She had never danced with anyone beyond the quiet, private lessons her mother had given her as a child, humming melodies in their small kitchen, while flour dusted the air around them. She had certainly never danced in front of hundreds of watching strangers, let alone beside the prince of the entire kingdom. "You seem tense," Adrian observed, guiding her gently into the first steps of the dance, his hand warm and steady against hers. "I am terrified I will step on your boots," Alina admitted, and to her surprise he laughed again, that same genuine sound she had heard earlier, unguarded and warm. "I have survived worse than a misplaced foot," he said. "Though I admit, most of my dance partners are far more concerned with impressing me than confessing their fears aloud." "Perhaps that is because most of your dance partners have practiced far more than I have," Alina replied, some of her nervousness easing as the music carried them into a gentle rhythm, neither too fast nor too demanding. "Perhaps," he agreed, "or perhaps they simply believe honesty is not permitted in a palace ballroom. I find that a strange rule if it is one. I would much rather hear the truth from someone than listen to another hour of careful compliments meaning nothing at all." Alina considered this as they turned slowly across the floor, the chandeliers above scattering warm light across the polished marble. "You must hear a great many compliments," she said. "Being who you are." "More than I know what to do with," he admitted, a faint weariness slipping into his voice for just a moment before he composed himself again. "Most people who speak to me are not speaking to me at all. They are speaking to the crown, to the throne I will one day inherit, to whatever favor or advantage they hope to gain by standing near me. It becomes difficult, after a while, to tell the difference between someone who wishes to know you and someone who wishes to know what you can offer them." "That sounds lonely," Alina said quietly, and she meant it, surprising herself with the depth of sympathy she felt for a man who, by every outward measure, seemed to have everything anyone could wish for. Adrian glanced at her, something shifting behind his eyes as though her words had struck closer to the truth than he expected. "It is," he admitted, "though I do not often say so aloud. It does not seem a fitting complaint for a prince to make." "I think everyone is allowed loneliness," Alina said, "regardless of what they wear or what title precedes their name. Loneliness does not check a person's rank before deciding to visit them." He studied her for a long moment as the music shifted into a slower passage, his expression thoughtful. "You speak as though you understand that particular visitor well yourself." Alina hesitated, unsure how much of her life she wished to share with a stranger, prince or otherwise, in the middle of a crowded ballroom. But something about the honesty already exchanged between them made the walls she usually kept so carefully in place feel less necessary. At least for this one conversation. At least for this one night that already felt separate from the rest of her ordinary life. "My mother died when I was young," she said finally. "My father remarried and passed away himself 2 years later. Since then I have lived with my stepmother and stepsisters, though lived is perhaps too generous a word. I exist within their household. I am given a roof and meals in exchange for cleaning, mending, and remaining as invisible as possible." Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, though his steps never faltered. "That is not a life. That is servitude disguised as family." "I have grown accustomed to it," Alina said, though even as she spoke the words, she recognized how hollow they sounded, how many years she had spent convincing herself that acceptance was the same thing as peace. "Accustomed does not mean acceptable," Adrian said firmly. "No one should grow accustomed to being made small by people who are meant to care for them." Alina felt something tighten in her chest, a mixture of gratitude and unexpected vulnerability. No one outside of Mrs. Whitfield had ever spoken to her this way, had ever suggested that the life she led was anything other than the natural consequence of circumstances beyond anyone's control. Hearing it named so plainly, so firmly, by someone who had known her for less than an hour, left her feeling strangely exposed, as though a curtain she had kept drawn for years had suddenly been pulled aside. "You are very direct, Your Highness," she said, attempting a lightness she did not entirely feel. "I have been told it is one of my less charming qualities," he said, a small smile returning to his face. though I prefer to think of it as honesty, which you yourself claimed to admire only moments ago." "I did say that," Alina admitted, allowing herself a small smile in return. The dance drew to its natural close, the final notes of the melody fading into the general hum of conversation and laughter that filled the hall. Neither of them moved immediately to separate, both lingering a moment longer than strictly necessary, though Alina was careful to release his hand and step back with proper decorum, aware once again of the many eyes still watching their every movement. "Thank you for the dance," she said, "and for earlier, though I still do not fully understand why you chose to help me." "I did not choose to help you," Adrian said, his voice quieter now, meant only for her. "I chose to correct an injustice. There is a difference. Helping implies you needed rescuing. Watching you stand there before that crowd, refusing to shrink no matter how loudly they laughed, told me quite clearly that you needed no rescue at all. You simply deserved better than what they were offering you." Alina did not know how to respond to that, her chest tight with an emotion she could not quite name, something between gratitude and disbelief, and a cautious, fragile hope she was almost afraid to acknowledge. Before she could find the words, a voice called Adrian's name from across the hall, an older man in formal dress gesturing him toward a group of visiting dignitaries waiting near the throne. "I am afraid duty calls," Adrian said, a note of genuine reluctance in his voice, "though I hope this is not the last conversation we share tonight." "I hope so as well," Alina said, and meant it more than she had meant almost anything in a very long time. He offered her a small bow, formal and respectful, and turned to join the waiting dignitaries, leaving Alina standing alone near the edge of the dance floor, her heart still racing from everything that had happened in the space of a single hour. She pressed a hand briefly against her chest, trying to steady her breathing, trying to make sense of a night that had begun with humiliation, and had somehow, impossibly, turned into something she never could have anticipated. She did not notice, at first, the pair of eyes watching her from across the room with far less kindness than the prince had shown. Beatrice stood near the refreshment table once more, her burgundy gown no longer catching admiring glances the way it had at the start of the evening, her attention fixed entirely on Alina with an intensity that bordered on hatred. Beside her, Priya whispered something urgent, glancing nervously between her sister and the scene that had just unfolded. "This cannot be allowed to continue," Beatrice muttered, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. "She is nothing, a servant in mother's house, wearing a stained rag of a dress, and somehow the prince danced with her before he even glanced in our direction." "Perhaps it means nothing," Priya offered, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps he simply felt sorry for her." "Princes do not dance out of pity," Beatrice snapped. "Not like that, not for that long, and not while smiling the way he was smiling." She set down her glass with more force than necessary, the crystal clinking sharply against the table. "We need to speak with Mother. Something must be done before this goes any further." Across the room, oblivious to the quiet storm gathering against her, Alina allowed herself, for just a moment, to simply enjoy the warmth still lingering from the dance, the music, the unexpected kindness of a stranger who had seen something in her that most people overlooked entirely. She did not yet know how quickly that warmth would be tested, or how far her stepmother and stepsisters were willing to go to ensure that whatever had begun between Alina and the prince tonight would never be allowed to continue. Mrs. Whitfield found her a short while later, weaving through the crowd with a knowing smile already forming on her lips. "I heard what happened," she said, taking Alina's hands warmly in her own. "The entire hall is speaking of nothing else, the prince and the mysterious girl in the remarkable dress." "It is not remarkable," Alina said, laughing softly despite herself. "It is tea. I spilled tea on myself." "Well," Mrs. Whitfield said, her eyes twinkling with amusement, "it seems the prince has excellent taste in fashion, and even better taste in the girls he chooses to defend from cruelty." She studied Alina's face more closely, her expression softening. "You look happy, dear, truly happy." "I cannot remember the last time I saw that particular look on your face." Alina felt her cheeks warm again, unable to deny the truth of it. I feel happy, she admitted quietly, for the first time in longer than I can remember. Then hold on to that feeling, Mrs. Whitfield said, squeezing her hands gently. Whatever happens after tonight, remember that you deserve this feeling, and do not let anyone convince you otherwise. Elena nodded, though a small, uncertain flicker of worry stirred somewhere beneath her happiness, a quiet awareness that the night was far from over, and that not everyone in the palace tonight wished to see her happiness continue. That worry proved well-founded within the half-hour. Elena's stepmother, a tall woman named Cordelia with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, approached her near one of the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens, her expression arranged into the polite mask she wore whenever appearances mattered most. To anyone watching from a distance, it might have looked like an ordinary conversation between mother and daughter. Only Elena could see the tightness at the corners of Cordelia's mouth, the warning glint in her eyes. "You have made quite a spectacle of yourself tonight," Cordelia said quietly, her voice pitched low enough that no one else could overhear. "Dancing with the prince, drawing attention. I did not raise you to behave so boldly." "You did not raise me at all," Elena said, the words leaving her mouth before she could stop them, surprising herself with their steadiness. "I raised myself, mostly, after father passed, and I did nothing tonight except accept an invitation I was given honestly and speak with a man who chose to speak with me first." Cordelia's eyes narrowed, though she kept her voice carefully controlled, aware of the guests moving past them in steady streams. "Do not mistake his attention for anything lasting. Men like him grow bored quickly with novelty. Tomorrow he will have forgotten your name entirely, and you will return home to the same life you have always led. I would advise you to remember that before you allow yourself to hope for more." "Perhaps you are right," Elena said, refusing to let the words wound her the way Cordelia intended. "But tonight, at least, I danced at the palace ball, and no one can take that memory away from me, whatever happens tomorrow." Something flickered across Cordelia's face, an emotion Elena could not quite name, gone before she could examine it closely. Without another word, her stepmother turned and walked away, disappearing back into the crowd, leaving Elena standing alone by the window with her heart still pounding from the exchange. She looked out over the moonlit gardens, taking a slow breath to steady herself, and told herself that whatever came next, she would not allow anyone to diminish the happiness she had found tonight, however brief it might prove to be. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of music and color. Elena did not dance with the prince again, though she caught his eye more than once across the crowded hall, each glance accompanied by a small, private smile that felt like a secret shared between only the two of them. She spoke with several other guests as the night wore on, some curious about the strange rumor of her remarkable dress, others simply drawn by the quiet confidence she now carried, so different from the timid, invisible girl who had walked through the palace doors only hours earlier. As the clock crept toward midnight, Mrs. Whitfield found her once more, gently reminding her that the borrowed carriage needed to return before the hour grew too late, lest questions arise about where it had gone. Elena nodded, suddenly aware of how tired she felt beneath the lingering excitement, the emotional weight of the evening finally beginning to settle over her shoulders. She made her way toward the entrance, weaving through clusters of guests still deep in conversation, when a familiar voice called out behind her, warm and slightly breathless, as though its owner had hurried to catch her before she disappeared entirely. "You are leaving already?" Adrian asked, appearing at her side with an expression that mixed genuine disappointment with polite restraint, mindful of the many eyes still tracking his every movement throughout the hall. "I am afraid I must," Elena said. "The carriage is borrowed, and I do not wish to cause trouble for the kind woman who arranged it." Adrian nodded, understanding evident in his eyes, though reluctance lingered in the set of his shoulders. "Then allow me at least to walk you to the door." They made their way together through the thinning crowd, guests parting respectfully as they passed, whispers following in their wake though neither of them paid the murmurs any mind. At the top of the grand staircase leading down toward the waiting carriages, Adrian paused, turning to face her fully. "I meant what I said earlier," he told her. About wanting to hear more of your story. Tonight was far too brief a conversation for everything I find myself wishing to ask you." "I would like that," Alina said honestly, her heart lifting at the sincerity in his voice. "Though I do not know how such a thing would be arranged. I am not accustomed to receiving invitations to the palace, and I doubt tonight's fortune will repeat itself easily." "Leave that concern to me," Adrian said, a determined glint entering his eyes. "I have not spent an evening this interesting in longer than I can remember, and I do not intend to let it end here, not if you are willing to see me again." "I am willing," Alina said softly, and the smile that crossed his face in response was unlike any expression she had seen him wear throughout the entire evening, unguarded and genuine, and entirely without the careful composure expected of a prince in a crowded room. She descended the staircase moments later, glancing back once to see him still standing at the top, watching her go with an expression she carried with her all the way home, replaying it over and over in her mind, as the carriage rattled through the dark countryside beneath a sky full of stars. Whatever tomorrow held, whatever difficulties her stepmother and stepsisters might attempt to create, Alina knew with quiet certainty that something significant had shifted within her tonight, something she was not willing to let go of easily. By the following morning, the story of the prince and the girl in the remarkable stained dress had already begun spreading well beyond the palace walls. Servants who had witnessed the scene shared it with the merchants delivering morning bread, who shared it with their customers, who carried the tale into every corner of the town before the sun had fully risen. By midday, 3 different versions of the story circulated through the marketplace, each one slightly more elaborate than the last, though all of them agreed on one central detail. The prince had shown clear and unmistakable interest in a young woman whose name few in town recognized. Alina heard the rumors secondhand from Mrs. Whitfield, who arrived at the house with a basket of vegetables as an excuse to visit, though her real purpose was clearly to share the latest gossip circulating through the market square. "They are saying the fabric came from a kingdom across the sea," Mrs. Whitfield reported, settling into a chair at the kitchen table while Alina continued kneading dough for the evening meal, her hands moving automatically through the familiar motions even as her mind remained elsewhere. "Some claim it took 3 months to create, dyed using flowers that only bloom once a year. Others insist it was a gift from a foreign king, meant to test whether our prince could recognize true elegance beneath simple appearances." Alina laughed despite herself, shaking her head at the absurdity of it all. "It was tea, Mrs. Whitfield. Plain, ordinary tea, spilled because my hands were shaking too badly to hold the cup steady." "I know that, dear, and you know that," Mrs. Whitfield said, her eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. "But the rest of the town seems quite determined to believe otherwise, and I confess I have not corrected a single person who has asked me about it. Let them believe what they wish. It has certainly given people something more interesting to discuss than the usual complaints about weather and taxes." Alina's amusement faded slightly as she thought of what her stepmother and stepsisters must be hearing, must be feeling, as the story continued to spread. Sure enough, less than an hour after Mrs. Whitfield departed, Beatrice stormed into the kitchen, her face flushed with barely controlled anger. "Do you have any idea what people are saying?" Beatrice demanded, slamming a basket of mail onto the table hard enough to rattle the wooden bowls resting nearby. "They are saying you started a new fashion trend. They are saying half the noblewomen in the kingdom are searching for fabric dyers who can replicate your dress. Your dress, Alina, the stained rag you wore because you could not be bothered to keep your hands steady." "I did not ask for any of this," Alina said calmly, continuing to knead the dough despite the tension gathering in the room. "I do not control what people choose to believe." "You could have corrected them," Beatrice snapped. "You could have told everyone the truth, that it was an accident, nothing more. Instead, you allowed this ridiculous story to grow, allowed the prince to make fools of everyone who laughed at you last night." "I did not allow anything," Alina said, finally looking up from her work to meet her stepsister's furious gaze directly. "The prince spoke those words himself, in front of dozens of witnesses. I never claimed the mark was anything other than what it truly is. If people choose to believe an interesting story rather than a boring truth, that is hardly something I can control, nor is it something I owe anyone an explanation for. Beatrice's jaw tightened, clearly searching for a response and finding none that satisfied her. Priya appeared in the doorway a moment later, her expression more thoughtful than angry, studying Alina, with an intensity that suggested she was reconsidering something she had believed certain until now. "He asked about you specifically," Priya said quietly, addressing Alina directly for the first time since the previous evening. "This morning, a messenger arrived at Lady Winslow's estate, inquiring after guests who attended the ball, asking specifically whether anyone knew the family of Alina Whitmore. Lady Winslow's daughter told me herself, not an hour ago." The kitchen fell silent, the only sound the soft thud of dough against the wooden table as Alina continued her work, though her hands had begun to tremble slightly, betraying the calm she tried so hard to project. A messenger asking after her. The prince inquiring about her family, her circumstances, perhaps even her whereabouts. It seemed too impossible to be true, and yet Priya had no reason to invent such a specific detail. "What did the messenger want?" Alina asked, unable to keep the eagerness entirely out of her voice. "No one knows for certain," Priya admitted. Lady Winslow assumed it was simply routine curiosity, the kind of thing that follows any interesting rumor from the palace. But it seemed rather deliberate to me, asking specifically for your family by name. Cordelia entered the kitchen at that moment, having overheard enough of the conversation from the hallway to understand its significance. Her expression, usually so carefully controlled, betrayed a flicker of genuine alarm before she composed herself once more. "This has gone far enough," she said, her voice sharp and decisive. "I will not have this household become the subject of palace gossip because of one foolish accident with a teacup. Alina, you will not speak of last night to anyone outside this house. If the prince or his messengers make further inquiries, you will say nothing that encourages further attention." "Why?" Alina asked, genuinely confused by the intensity of her stepmother's reaction. "What harm could come from the prince showing interest in our family?" "Because interest from someone of his position is never simple," Cordelia said, her voice tight with something Alina could not quite identify, perhaps fear, perhaps calculation, perhaps some tangled combination of both. "It invites scrutiny. It invites questions about our family, our finances, our history, questions I have worked very hard to keep buried. You will do as I say, Alina, and you will do it without argument." Alina studied her stepmother's face, searching for the source of such sudden and fierce resistance, but Cordelia's expression had already smoothed back into its usual careful neutrality, offering no further explanation. Whatever secrets lay behind her stepmother's insistence, Alina sensed she would need to uncover them on her own, through careful observation rather than direct questioning. That evening, as Alina lay awake in her small room beneath the eaves, staring up at the shadows dancing across the ceiling, she found herself replaying every moment of the previous night, searching for some sign, some clue she might have missed about the true depth of the prince's interest. Was it simple kindness, the sort any decent person might show toward someone treated unfairly? Or was it something more, something that might genuinely continue beyond the boundaries of a single evening? She did not have long to wonder. 3 days later, as she hung laundry in the small yard behind the house, humming quietly to herself in the warm afternoon sun, the sound of an approaching carriage drew her attention toward the front of the property. It was finer than any carriage that had ever stopped at their modest home, its polished wood gleaming beneath a crest Alina recognized immediately from the coins she had handled throughout her life. Her heart began to race as she watched a footman step down and approach the front door, a sealed letter held carefully in his gloved hands. Cordelia answered the door herself, and Alina watched from the yard as her stepmother's face shifted through a rapid series of expressions, surprise giving way to calculation, calculation giving way to something colder still. After a brief exchange with the footman, Cordelia closed the door and turned, her eyes finding Alina across the distance of the yard, with an intensity that made Alina's stomach twist with sudden, unexplained dread. It seems, Cordelia said, her voice carrying an edge Alina had rarely heard before, that the prince has requested your presence at the palace, formally this time, an invitation addressed specifically to you. Alina felt her breath catch in her throat, joy and fear tangling together so tightly she could not separate one from the other. Behind her stepmother, she could see Beatrice and Priya appearing in the doorway, their expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and something far more dangerous, something that looked, unmistakably, like the beginnings of a plan neither of them intended to share with her. Alina crossed the yard quickly, wiping her damp hands against her apron, and held out her hand expectantly. "May I see it, please?" Cordelia hesitated for a long moment, the sealed letter held just out of reach, before finally, reluctantly, passing it over. Alina broke the wax seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the thick paper inside, her eyes scanning the elegant, looping handwriting that filled the page. The invitation was formal in its language, requesting the presence of Miss Alina Whitmore at a private garden reception to be held at the palace the following week, an occasion far smaller and more intimate than the grand ball, intended, the letter explained, for the prince to become better acquainted with select guests whose company he had found particularly engaging. Beneath the formal invitation, in handwriting that was noticeably less practiced than the rest of the letter, as though written separately and added afterward, a short personal note had been included. Alina read it twice before she trusted herself to understand its meaning correctly. "I meant what I said at the top of the staircase. I hope you will come, Adrian." She pressed the letter gently against her chest, unable to stop the smile spreading across her face despite the tense atmosphere surrounding her in the yard. Cordelia watched this display with visible displeasure, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You cannot possibly attend," Cordelia said flatly. "We have no suitable dress for such an occasion, no proper transportation befitting a palace reception, and frankly, no interest in encouraging whatever misguided fascination the prince has developed." "I will find a way," Alina said, refusing to let her stepmother's objections dampen the fragile hope blooming in her chest. "Mrs. Whitfield has helped me before. She will help me again." "Mrs. Whitfield is an interfering old woman who should mind her own affairs," Cordelia snapped, though her sharp words did nothing to diminish the determination now settling firmly across Alina's features. That evening, after the household had quieted and her stepmother and stepsisters had retired to their rooms, Alina crept down to the kitchen with a single candle, unable to sleep with so many thoughts crowding her mind. She found Priya already there, seated at the table with a cup of cooling tea in front of her, an expression of unusual thoughtfulness on her face. "I could not sleep either," Priya admitted, when Alina hesitated in the doorway, uncertain whether to enter. Alina settled cautiously into the chair across from her stepsister, setting her candle down between them. "Are you angry with me as well?" Priya considered the question longer than Alina expected, turning her teacup slowly in her hands. "I do not know what I am," she admitted finally. "I have spent so many years believing certain things were simply true, that you existed to serve this household, that Beatrice and I were meant for grander things, that the order of our lives was fixed and unchangeable. Watching the prince speak to you the way he did, watching him send that letter today, it makes me wonder whether I have been wrong about a great many things." "I never wish to compete with you or Beatrice," Alina said quietly. "I only wish to survive within this house without causing trouble." "I know that," Priya said, and for the first time since their father's death, Alina heard something like genuine regret in her stepsister's voice. "I am not certain I have always treated you fairly, Alina. I am not certain any of us have." The confession hung between them in the flickering candlelight, fragile and unexpected, though Alina did not dare hope it signaled any lasting change. She had learned, through years of careful observation, that kindness within this household rarely lasted longer than the mood that produced it. Still, she allowed herself a small measure of gratitude for the moment, however temporary it might prove to be. "Beatrice will not feel the same way," Alina said, and Priya's expression confirmed the truth of this before she even spoke. Beatrice believes she has been cheated of something, Priya said carefully. She has always assumed that a prince, if one ever noticed our family at all, would notice her first. Watching him choose you instead, and choose you so publicly, has wounded something in her that I do not think will heal easily or gracefully. Alina thought of Beatrice's furious expression in the kitchen earlier that day, the barely restrained anger simmering beneath every word she spoke. She thought, too, of her stepmother's strange insistence that the prince's attention invited dangerous scrutiny, an explanation that had never fully made sense to her. Something about the pieces did not fit together cleanly, and Alina found herself wondering, not for the first time, whether there were secrets within this household that extended far beyond simple jealousy over a prince's attention. "Priya," she said slowly, "why does mother react so strongly to the idea of scrutiny? What could a prince's interest possibly uncover about our family?" Priya's expression shifted, something guarded settling back over her features, and Alina understood immediately that she had touched upon something her stepsister was either unwilling or unable to discuss. "I do not know," Priya said, though her voice lacked full conviction. "Perhaps it is simply pride. Mother has always cared a great deal about how our family appears to others." Alina did not press further, sensing that whatever truth lay beneath her stepmother's fear, Priya either did not know it fully or was not yet ready to share it. She rose from the table, thanking her stepsister quietly for the unexpected conversation, and made her way back toward her small room beneath the eaves, her mind now occupied by two separate concerns tangled together: the joy of the prince's invitation, and the uneasy sense that something within her own household remained hidden, waiting to surface at the least convenient moment. The week leading up to the garden reception passed in a strange mixture of anticipation and quiet dread. Mrs. Whitfield, true to her word, arrived 2 days before the event with a simple but well-made dress borrowed from her niece, a soft green gown that fit Alina reasonably well after a few careful adjustments with needle and thread. It was nothing so grand as the gowns Beatrice and Priya owned, but it was clean, unstained, and entirely her own to wear without borrowed shawls or careful arrangement of fabric to hide any secrets. "You look lovely," Mrs. Whitfield said, stepping back to admire her work as Alina turned slowly before the small mirror in her room. "Though I suspect the prince would find you equally lovely wearing a potato sack, given how he looked at you at the ball." Alina laughed, though a flush of warmth colored her cheeks at the memory. "You did not even see how he looked at me. You were on the other side of the hall." "I did not need to see it myself," Mrs. Whitfield said, her eyes twinkling with knowing amusement. "The entire town has described it to me at least a dozen times by now, each version more romantic than the last. I imagine by the time the story finishes traveling through every household in the kingdom, he will have proposed marriage on the spot." "Please do not repeat that particular rumor," Alina said, laughing again despite herself, though the mention of marriage sent an unexpected flutter through her chest that she quickly tried to dismiss as foolish, premature hope. On the morning of the reception, Cordelia insisted on inspecting Alina's appearance before she departed, though her scrutiny seemed motivated less by genuine care and more by anxious calculation, as though she were assessing a risk she could not fully control. Beatrice and Priya watched from the parlor doorway, Priya's expression unreadable, Beatrice's carefully composed into polite indifference that did not quite mask the tension visible in the tight line of her shoulders. "Remember what I told you," Cordelia said quietly, gripping Alina's arm as the carriage waited outside. "Say nothing of our family's circumstances, nothing of your father, nothing of the years since his passing. If the prince asks personal questions, redirect the conversation gracefully. Do you understand?" "I understand your instructions," Alina said carefully, "though I do not understand your reasons for giving them." Cordelia's grip tightened briefly before releasing entirely, her expression closing off any further discussion. "Simply do as I ask, Alina. For once in your life, trust that I know what is best for this family." Alina said nothing further, climbing into the carriage with Mrs. Whitfield's borrowed dress carefully arranged around her. her mind turning over her stepmother's strange warning even as the carriage carried her toward the palace grounds. Whatever secret Cordelia guarded so fiercely, it clearly involved more than simple pride, and Alina found herself increasingly determined to understand it, though she pushed the concern aside for now, unwilling to let it overshadow the excitement building within her chest as the palace gates came into view once more. The garden reception proved far more intimate than the grand ball, held within a walled courtyard filled with blooming roses and the gentle sound of a fountain trickling somewhere among the greenery. Perhaps 30 guests mingled beneath strings of small lanterns, their conversations soft and unhurried compared to the boisterous energy of the previous event. Alina spotted Adrian almost immediately, standing near the fountain in conversation with an older gentleman whose formal bearing suggested some position of importance within the royal court. He noticed her within moments, and Alina watched as his entire posture shifted, a genuine smile breaking across his face as he excused himself from his conversation and crossed the courtyard toward her. "You came," he said, and the relief evident in his voice told Alina he had genuinely worried she might not. "I told you I would," Alina said, smiling despite the nervous flutter still lingering in her stomach. "You did," he agreed, "though I confess I spent the better part of this week wondering whether circumstances might prevent you, or whether you might reconsider entirely once the excitement of the ball had faded." "The excitement has not faded," Alina admitted honestly. "If anything, I have thought of little else." They spent the next hour walking slowly through the garden paths, Adrian pointing out particular flowers his mother had personally requested be planted years earlier, sharing small memories of childhood spent within these same walls before the weight of royal responsibility had settled fully onto his shoulders. Alina found herself sharing more of her own history than she had originally intended, describing her mother's gentle humor, the small kitchen where she had learned to bake bread, the quiet grief that still occasionally caught her unexpectedly, years after her mother's passing. "You speak of her with such warmth," Adrian observed, "despite how much you clearly still miss her." "She taught me that grief and love are not separate things," Alina said. "That missing someone is simply another way of continuing to love them, even after they are gone." Adrian studied her for a long moment, something soft and unguarded in his expression. "I find myself wishing I had known her. Anyone capable of raising a daughter with such clarity and strength must have been a remarkable woman." Alina felt tears threaten unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, surprised by the sudden wave of emotion his simple words provoked. Before she could respond, however, a sharp voice cut across the garden path, shattering the quiet intimacy of the moment entirely. "Your Highness," Beatrice called out, appearing around a hedge with Priya trailing slightly behind her, both dressed in their finest gowns despite having received no formal invitation to the smaller gathering. "What a delightful surprise to find you here." Alina felt her stomach drop, understanding immediately that her stepsister's presence was no accident, that they had somehow arranged to attend an event meant to include only a select handful of guests. Adrian's expression shifted subtly, polite but noticeably cooler than the warmth he had shown Alina only moments before. "Miss Beatrice," he said, offering a formal nod, "I do not recall extending an invitation to your family for today's reception." "Oh, we simply could not resist accompanying our dear sister," Beatrice said smoothly, her smile never wavering despite the pointed nature of his observation. "We worried she might feel overwhelmed attending such an important occasion alone, given her unfamiliarity with proper palace etiquette." Alina felt heat rise in her cheeks at the thinly veiled insult, though she said nothing, unwilling to give Beatrice the satisfaction of an obvious reaction. Adrian, however, seemed entirely unmoved by the comment, his expression remaining carefully neutral. "Miss Whitmore has managed the palace and its etiquette admirably well without assistance," he said evenly, "both at the ball and here today. I see no cause for concern on that account." Beatrice's smile tightened almost imperceptibly, though she recovered quickly, gesturing toward Priya beside her. Of course, Your Highness, we only wish to offer our support. Family should always stand together, especially during moments that carry such significance for our household's reputation. The emphasis she placed on certain words did not escape Alina's notice, nor, she suspected, Adrian's. There was something calculated in Beatrice's phrasing, a subtle threat woven beneath the surface of polite conversation, though Alina could not immediately determine its precise target. Priya, standing quietly beside her sister, appeared distinctly uncomfortable, her eyes flickering repeatedly toward Alina with something that looked almost like apology. "If you will excuse us," Adrian said, his tone leaving little room for further conversation. "Miss Whitmore and I were in the midst of a private discussion before your arrival." He extended his arm toward Alina, a clear signal that the interruption had concluded, and Alina accepted gratefully, allowing him to guide her further down the garden path, away from her stepsister's pointed attention. She glanced back once, catching Beatrice's expression as they walked away, and felt a chill settle over her despite the warm afternoon sun. Whatever calculation moved behind her stepsister's carefully composed features, it promised nothing good for the days ahead. "I apologize for their intrusion," Alina said, once they had moved sufficiently far from earshot. "I did not know they intended to come." "You have nothing to apologize for," Adrian said firmly. "Though I confess, their behavior raises questions I find myself increasingly curious to answer. Your stepsister mentioned your family's reputation quite deliberately. Is there something specific she meant to imply?" Alina hesitated, remembering her stepmother's strict instructions to reveal nothing of their family's private affairs. But something in Adrian's steady, patient expression made the weight of that promised silence feel increasingly difficult to maintain, especially as her own curiosity about her stepmother's fears continued to grow alongside it. "I do not fully know myself," Alina admitted honestly. "My stepmother has always guarded certain details of our family's history quite closely. She instructed me this very morning to reveal nothing personal during today's reception, though she never explained precisely what she feared I might reveal." Adrian's expression grew thoughtful, a new seriousness entering his eyes. "That is curious indeed. Families rarely guard secrets so carefully unless something significant lies beneath the surface." He paused, studying her carefully. "Would it trouble you if I made a few careful inquiries? Not to cause harm to your family, but simply to understand what shadow seems to follow you so persistently." Alina considered this for a long moment, weighing her loyalty to a household that had shown her little genuine warmth against her own growing unease about the secrets clearly buried within its history. "I do not think it would trouble me," she said finally. "Whatever the truth is, I would rather understand it than continue living beneath its shadow without knowing its shape." Adrian nodded, something resolute settling into his expression. "Then I will look into it discreetly, I promise you that. Whatever we find, we will face it together." Alina felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, at the easy way he had said together, as though her burdens had already become something he intended to share rather than simply observe from a comfortable distance. She did not yet know what secrets awaited discovery, nor how deeply they might reshape everything she believed about her own history. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel entirely alone in facing whatever came next. Back at the house that evening, Beatrice paced the length of the parlor while Cordelia sat rigidly in her favorite chair, her fingers pressed against her temples as though warding off a headache. Priya remained near the window, watching the darkening garden outside rather than meeting either of their eyes. "He as good as dismissed us," Beatrice said, her voice sharp with barely controlled fury. "In front of half the guests at that reception, he looked at us as though we were nothing more than an inconvenience standing between him and Alina." "You should not have gone at all," Cordelia said wearily. "I warned you both that drawing further attention to this situation would only make matters worse." "Worse than watching him fall further under her spell with every passing day?" Beatrice demanded. "Mother, if he continues pursuing her, if their connection grows any deeper, do you truly believe our secrets will remain hidden much longer? He has resources. He has investigators. He could uncover the truth about father's debts," about the money that vanished after his death, about everything you have spent years trying to bury. Cordelia's face paled visibly, her composure cracking for just a moment before she forced it back into place. "Lower your voice," she hissed, glancing toward the doorway as though Alina might be listening from just beyond it, though she had not yet returned from the palace. "If that information becomes public, this family will be ruined entirely. Not simply embarrassed, ruined. We would lose this house, our standing in the community, everything your father and I built before his passing. Then we must ensure Alina's connection to the prince ends before that happens," Beatrice said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Priya turned from the window then, her expression troubled. "What exactly are you suggesting, Beatrice?" "I am suggesting we find a way to make Alina undesirable in his eyes," Beatrice said, though something in her tone suggested she had not yet fully worked out the details of such a plan. "Perhaps we simply need to remind him of her circumstances. Her lack of proper education, her lack of any true family standing, her complete unsuitability as a match for someone of his position." "He already knows her circumstances," Priya pointed out. "He has known from the very beginning, and it has not deterred him in the slightest. If anything, it seems to have deepened his interest rather than diminished it." Beatrice's jaw tightened at this observation, clearly frustrated by its accuracy. "Then we will find another way. There must be something, some weakness we can exploit." Cordelia rose slowly from her chair, moving to stand before the cold fireplace, her expression distant and troubled. "There is one possibility," she said quietly, almost to herself, "though I had hoped never to consider it." Both her daughters turned toward her expectantly, waiting for her to continue, but Cordelia said nothing further that evening, retreating instead to her room with a heaviness that neither Beatrice nor Priya had witnessed in her before. Whatever plan had begun forming within her mind, she kept its details carefully guarded, even from her own daughters, leaving only a lingering sense of unease hanging in the air of the darkened parlor long after she had gone. Alina, unaware of the conversation unfolding in her absence, returned home that evening in a state of quiet contentment, her mind still replaying every moment of her walk through the palace gardens with Adrian. She noticed immediately upon entering that something in the household's atmosphere had shifted, a tension thick enough to feel even before anyone spoke a word to her, but she attributed it simply to lingering resentment over the events of the reception, and retired to her room without pressing further, exhausted from the emotional weight of the day. She did not know, as she drifted into peaceful sleep that night, that her stepmother had already begun composing a letter in the privacy of her own room, a letter intended for someone Alina had never heard mentioned within this household before, someone whose name carried significance Cordelia had worked desperately to keep buried for many years. The letter would take 3 days to reach its intended recipient, and its consequences would arrive at Alina's door not long after, unraveling threads of her past she had never known existed, threads that would test not only her fragile new happiness with the prince, but everything she believed she understood about her own family's history. For now, though, Alina slept peacefully, dreaming of garden paths and warm laughter and a promise spoken quietly beneath strings of golden lanterns, unaware that the ground beneath her carefully rebuilt life was already beginning, quietly and invisibly, to shift. 3 days later, a second carriage arrived at the house, though this one carried no royal crest, no polished footman in fine livery. It was plain and travel-worn, and the man who stepped down from it moved with the stiff formality of someone accustomed to conducting unpleasant business. Alina watched from an upstairs window as Cordelia greeted him at the door with an expression of forced civility, ushering him quickly into the parlor and closing the door firmly behind them. She did not recognize the man, though something about his presence filled her with an inexplicable unease she could not immediately name. She descended the stairs quietly, intending only to pass through the hallway toward the kitchen, but paused when she heard her own name spoken clearly through the parlor door, left open just a crack. "Alina has grown into quite a suitable young woman," the man's voice said, low and measured. "I confess I did not expect to hear from you again after all these years, Cordelia, but your letter arrived at a fortunate time. My circumstances have changed considerably since we last corresponded. The arrangement your late brother made with her father still stands, does it not? Cordelia asked, her voice tight with barely concealed urgency. The betrothal contract was never formally dissolved, only set aside when Alina was still a child. Alina's breath caught in her throat. Betrothal contract. She had never heard those words spoken in connection with her own name before, had never imagined that some agreement made long before she was old enough to understand its implications might still hold any binding power over her life. It remains valid, the man confirmed. Though I confess, I had assumed it abandoned entirely, given how many years have passed without any communication between our families. What has prompted your sudden interest in reviving it now? There was a long pause before Cordelia answered, and when she did, her voice had dropped low enough that Alina had to press closer to the door to catch her words. Circumstances have arisen that require a swift and decisive solution. Alina has attracted attention from someone whose interest threatens to expose certain difficulties within our family's finances, difficulties that trace back to decisions I made following her father's passing. If she were to become formally betrothed and married quickly, that attention would naturally dissolve, and our family's private affairs would remain exactly that. Private. Alina's hand pressed flat against the wall, her mind reeling as the pieces of her stepmother's fear finally began arranging themselves into a coherent, devastating picture. Cordelia had not simply been protecting the family's pride. She had used money, Alina's father's money, perhaps even money that should have belonged to Alina herself following his death, and she had spent years concealing that fact behind careful silence and strict instructions never to speak of family matters to outsiders. And the young woman herself, the man asked, does she know of this arrangement? Does she consent? She will consent, Cordelia said firmly, once she understands that the alternative is public disgrace for the entire family, disgrace that would follow her as much as it follows the rest of us. She is not without loyalty, whatever her recent behavior might suggest. Alina stepped back from the door slowly, her heart pounding so violently she feared they might hear it through the thin wood separating them. She made her way to the kitchen on unsteady legs, gripping the edge of the table for support as the full weight of what she had overheard settled over her like a physical burden. A betrothal contract, arranged when she was too young to understand its meaning, now being revived as a weapon to protect secrets that had nothing to do with her own choices or desires. And beneath it all, the devastating suggestion that her stepmother had, in some way, taken money that should have been hers, money left by her own father, and spent years concealing the theft behind careful management of appearances. She remained in the kitchen for the better part of an hour, her thoughts churning too violently to allow for any productive action, until the sound of the front door closing signaled the departure of the stranger who had arrived so unexpectedly that morning. Cordelia found her there shortly after, her expression composed once more into its familiar mask of controlled authority, though something new lingered beneath it now, a wariness that suggested she suspected, or perhaps feared, that Alina had overheard more than she should have. "We must speak," Cordelia said, settling into the chair across from Alina with unusual formality. "About your future." "I already know what you intend to discuss," Alina said quietly, surprising them both with the steadiness of her voice despite the storm raging beneath it. "I heard enough through the parlor door to understand the shape of your plan, even if I do not yet understand every detail behind it." Cordelia's composure faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly, folding her hands together on the table between them. "Then you understand the necessity of what must happen next. Lord Barrington's late brother arranged a betrothal contract with your father many years ago, before either of us imagined circumstances would unfold as they have. Lord Barrington himself has agreed to honor that arrangement, given his own family's current financial interests align favorably with such a match. You would want for nothing, Alina. A comfortable home, financial security, a respectable position within society far beyond anything I could otherwise offer you." "And what of the money?" Alina asked, her voice trembling now, though whether from anger or grief she could not entirely say. The money my father left behind, was any of it truly intended for me? Cordelia's expression flickered, guilt passing briefly across her features before she forced it back into careful neutrality. Your father's estate was complicated, Alina. There were debts I was forced to settle, obligations that required difficult decisions in the months following his passing. I did what I believed necessary to keep this household afloat, to keep a roof over all our heads, yours included. That is not an answer, Alina said. That is an excuse. Perhaps it is both, Cordelia admitted, something almost like weariness entering her voice for the first time since Alina had known her. I will not pretend every decision I made was entirely selfless, Alina. I will not pretend the years since your father's death have been simple or without difficult compromises. But whatever mistakes I have made, I am asking you now to consider the good this arrangement could bring, not only to yourself, but to this entire family. You are asking me to marry a stranger, Alina said, to protect secrets you created, secrets that may well involve money that should have been mine. And you expect me to simply agree without protest, because you have decided it is what must happen. I expect you to understand that families sometimes require sacrifice, Cordelia said, her voice hardening once more. I expect you to remember everything this household has provided you these past years, however imperfectly, and to consider that some debts, even unspoken ones, deserve to be repaid. Alina rose from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, unable to remain seated a moment longer beneath the weight of her stepmother's demand. I will not agree to this, she said firmly. Not without understanding the full truth of what happened to my father's money, and not without time to consider what I truly wish for my own life. You have very little time, Cordelia warned. Lord Barrington expects an answer within the week. If you refuse, I cannot guarantee what measures may become necessary to protect this family's reputation. Measures that could easily extend beyond simply revealing our financial difficulties. The implied threat hung heavy in the air between them, and Alina understood, with a cold clarity that settled deep into her chest, that her stepmother was prepared to use whatever leverage remained available to her, including perhaps even fabricated scandal involving Alina herself, should she continue to resist. She left the kitchen without another word, retreating to her room to think, her mind spinning with questions that demanded answers she did not yet possess. She thought immediately of Adrian, of his promise to look discreetly into whatever secrets seemed to trail her family so persistently. She needed to see him, needed to share what she had learned before her stepmother's plan could progress any further. But arranging such a meeting without her stepmother's knowledge would prove difficult, given how closely Cordelia now seemed determined to monitor her every movement. It was Priya, unexpectedly, who provided the solution. She appeared at Alina's door that evening, her expression grave, closing the door quietly behind her before speaking. I heard what happened, Priya said softly. The walls in this house carry sound further than Mother realizes. I am sorry, Alina, truly sorry. I did not know the full extent of what she had planned until today. Did you know about the money? Alina asked directly. About what happened to my father's estate. Priya hesitated, guilt evident in her expression. I suspected something was not entirely right years ago, when Mother suddenly began managing our finances so carefully, so differently than before. I never had proof, and I never asked directly. I am ashamed to admit I simply accepted the comfortable explanation that difficult circumstances required difficult choices, without questioning too deeply what those choices might have cost you specifically. Alina studied her stepsister's face, searching for any sign of continued deception, but found only genuine remorse looking back at her. I need to speak with Adrian, she said finally. I need to warn him what is happening, and I need his help understanding the truth behind my father's estate before Mother forces this betrothal upon me. Priya nodded slowly, resolve settling into her expression. I can help you slip away tomorrow morning while Mother attends to business in town. I owe you that much, Alina, and far more besides. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Alina felt something shift between herself and one of her stepsisters, a fragile bridge beginning to form across years of distance and quiet resentment. Whatever came next, whatever battles awaited her in the days ahead, she would not face them entirely alone, and that knowledge alone provided a small, steady comfort against the storm gathering around her. The following morning, true to her word, Priya created a convincing distraction, claiming she needed Alina's help selecting fabric in town for a dress she intended to have made, giving Alina the perfect excuse to leave the house while Cordelia remained occupied with her own errands elsewhere. Once safely away from the house, Alina hired a modest cart to carry her toward the palace, her heart pounding with nervous urgency the entire journey. She had no formal invitation for this visit, and she worried briefly that the palace guards might turn her away without one. But fortune favored her when she recognized a young footman near the gates, one who had served refreshments during the garden reception, and remembered her face from Adrian's obvious attention toward her that day. He agreed, after some hesitation, to carry a message to the prince requesting an urgent audience, and within 20 minutes, Alina found herself being escorted through the palace halls toward a small private study, her hands trembling with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Adrian rose immediately from behind his desk when she entered, concern evident in his expression at the clear distress written across her face. "Alina, what has happened? Your message said it was urgent." She told him everything, the words tumbling out faster than she intended, the overheard conversation between her stepmother and Lord Barrington, the revival of the childhood betrothal contract, the devastating implication that her father's money had been misused, and the looming threat that refusing the arrangement might invite even greater consequences upon her. Adrian listened without interruption, his expression growing steadily darker as the full scope of the situation became clear. "This is unacceptable," he said firmly, once she had finished. "No one should be forced into marriage against their will, particularly not to conceal financial misconduct that was never their responsibility to begin with. Alina, I promise you, this will not proceed as your stepmother intends." "I do not know what can be done," Alina admitted, some of her composure finally breaking as exhaustion and fear caught up with her all at once. "A betrothal contract carries legal weight. If Lord Barrington insists on honoring it, I may have very little power to refuse." "You have more power than you realize," Adrian said, moving around the desk to stand closer to her, his expression softening with genuine concern. "Betrothal contracts made on behalf of a minor child, without that child's informed consent as an adult, carry far less legal weight than your stepmother may have led you to believe. Additionally, if it can be demonstrated that your father's estate was mismanaged or funds were misappropriated, that alone opens a legal avenue that could void any arrangement built upon such circumstances." Alina felt a fragile thread of hope beginning to weave through the fear still gripping her chest. "You believe there is a way to fight this?" "I know there is," Adrian said with quiet conviction. "I have access to resources your stepmother does not, records, legal counsel, the ability to investigate financial matters that might otherwise remain hidden from someone in your position. Give me a few days, Alina. Let me look into your father's estate properly, and let me consult with the palace solicitors regarding the validity of this supposed betrothal contract. And if Lord Barrington demands an answer before you have time to investigate," Alina asked. "My stepmother said he expects a response within the week." Adrian's jaw set with quiet determination. "Then I will ensure he receives a response that satisfies him for the time being, one that buys us the time we need without committing you to anything against your wishes. Trust me, Alina, I do not intend to let this proceed unchallenged." Alina studied his face, searching for any hesitation, any sign that his promises exceeded what he genuinely intended to deliver, but found only steady resolve looking back at her. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why involve yourself so deeply in a problem that is not truly yours to solve?" Adrian reached out, gently taking her hand between both of his own, his expression open and unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before, not even during their most private conversations at the garden reception. Because somewhere between the stained dress at the ball and this conversation right now, you have become someone whose happiness matters to me a great deal, Alina. I do not intend to stand idle, while others attempt to control your future for reasons that have nothing to do with your own well-being. Alina felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his words, by the sheer relief of finally having someone stand firmly beside her against a burden she had carried largely alone for so many years. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to find any words adequate to the depth of gratitude she felt. "There is no need for thanks," Adrian said gently, echoing words he had spoken to her once before, on the night they first met. "Only trust that I intend to see this through, whatever it requires." She left the palace an hour later with cautious hope, replacing some of the fear that had consumed her since overhearing her stepmother's conversation with Lord Barrington. She did not yet know precisely what awaited her in the coming days, whether Adrian's promised investigation would uncover the truth she needed, whether her stepmother's plan could truly be stopped before it progressed too far to reverse. But for the first time since learning of the betrothal contract, she felt something other than helplessness, a steady, quiet determination settling into place beside her fear, ready to meet whatever challenges the coming days might bring. The days that followed passed with agonizing slowness. Alina continued her usual chores around the house, careful to betray no sign of the secret meeting or the plan now unfolding beyond her stepmother's awareness, though the strain of maintaining such composure left her exhausted by each evening. Cordelia, for her part, seemed increasingly anxious as the week progressed, watching Alina with sharp, calculating eyes, clearly wondering why her stepdaughter had not yet offered the protest or resistance she had expected. On the fourth day, a messenger arrived from the palace, delivering a formal letter addressed to Cordelia rather than Alina, its wax seal marked with the royal crest. Alina watched from the hallway as her stepmother read through its contents, her face shifting from confusion to alarm to something approaching panic as she reached the letter's conclusion. "What is this?" Beatrice demanded, noticing her mother's distress and crossing the room to read over her shoulder. "The palace is conducting a formal inquiry," Cordelia said, her voice tight and unsteady, "into the management of your father's estate following his death. They are requesting complete financial records, receipts, and documentation regarding all transactions made during the settlement of his affairs." "Why would the palace concern themselves with our private finances?" Beatrice asked, though the answer seemed to occur to her even as she spoke the question aloud, her eyes flicking toward Alina with dawning understanding and fresh anger. "This is your doing," Cordelia said, turning toward Alina with an expression of barely contained fury. "You went to him, you told him everything." "I told him the truth," Alina said steadily, refusing to shrink beneath her stepmother's glare despite the tension coiling tightly in her stomach. "The same truth you have spent years hiding from me. If there is nothing improper in how you managed my father's estate, this inquiry should present no difficulty at all." Cordelia's face paled, the accusation landing with visible weight. For a long moment she said nothing, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the letter against her chest. Priya, watching from the doorway, exchanged a brief glance with Alina, a silent acknowledgement passing between them of the fragile alliance they had formed. "You do not understand what you have done," Cordelia said finally, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier fury and replaced instead with something that sounded almost like fear. "If this inquiry proceeds, if certain records are examined too closely, the consequences will extend far beyond simple embarrassment." "Then perhaps," Alina said carefully, "it is time you told me the full truth yourself, rather than allowing an official inquiry to uncover it piece by piece." Cordelia sank slowly into a nearby chair, the letter still clutched in her trembling hands, and for the first time since Alina had known her, the carefully constructed mask of authority and control seemed to crumble entirely, revealing something far more vulnerable underneath. "Your father left you a considerable inheritance," she said quietly, not meeting Alina's eyes. "A sum meant to secure your future, held in trust until you reached a suitable age or married. I used a significant portion of it in the months following his death to settle debts he had accumulated that I did not learn of until after he had passed. Gambling debts, Alina. Debts that would have cost us this very house, our standing in the community, everything, had they gone unpaid. Alina felt the room tilt slightly around her, the revelation landing with unexpected force despite having half suspected some version of this truth already. My father gambled away money meant for our family. He kept it well hidden, Cordelia said, her voice thick with old grief and old shame. I did not learn the truth until creditors began arriving at our door within weeks of the funeral, demanding payment on debts I never knew existed. I used what remained of your inheritance to settle those debts quietly, before word could spread and destroy what little reputation this family still held. I intended, at the time, to eventually restore what I had used, but circumstances never allowed for it, and as the years passed, admitting the truth became increasingly difficult, until silence simply became the easier path. You could have told me, Alina said, her voice breaking slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. All these years, I believed my father left nothing behind, that our circumstances were simply the natural result of misfortune. I never imagined you were protecting a secret this significant, one that involved money that was rightfully mine. I know, Cordelia said, tears finally slipping down her carefully composed face. I have carried the guilt of that decision for years, Alina, though I never found the courage to correct it. When the betrothal contract with Lord Barrington resurfaced as a possibility, I saw a chance to resolve everything quietly, to secure your future through marriage while avoiding the shame of admitting what I had done. It was wrong of me. I understand that now, watching the consequences of my silence finally catching up to all of us. Alina stood in silence for a long moment, processing the weight of everything she had just learned, anger and grief, and something unexpectedly close to sympathy tangling together within her chest. Whatever mistakes Cordelia had made, whatever secrets she had guarded so fiercely, Alina could see now that fear, not cruelty, had driven many of her stepmother's harshest decisions over the years. The inquiry will proceed regardless, Alina said finally. But I do not wish to see this family ruined, Cordelia, whatever has passed between us. If you cooperate fully, if you return what remains recoverable and demonstrate honest intention going forward, I believe the palace will show mercy rather than seeking harsh punishment. Adrian is not interested in destroying this family. He simply wishes to see me protected from an arrangement I never consented to. Cordelia looked up at her, something like disbelief mixing with cautious hope in her tear-streaked expression. You would advocate for leniency after everything I have done. I am tired of anger, Alina said simply. I would rather build something new than continue carrying old resentments forward into whatever comes next. 3 days later, palace officials arrived to conduct a formal review of the estate's financial records, and Cordelia, true to the fragile agreement reached between herself and Alina, cooperated fully, providing every document requested without protest or evasion. The investigation revealed exactly what Cordelia had described: debts accumulated through her late husband's private gambling, settled quietly using funds meant for Alina's inheritance. With Adrian's quiet intervention on Alina's behalf, and Cordelia's full cooperation weighed favorably against her, the palace solicitors determined that criminal proceedings were unnecessary, though a formal repayment arrangement was established, requiring Cordelia to gradually restore what portion of the inheritance remained recoverable through careful management of the family's future finances. The betrothal contract, meanwhile, was declared void entirely, the palace solicitors confirming Adrian's earlier assessment that an agreement made on Alina's behalf as a child, without her informed adult consent, held no binding legal authority over her present circumstances. Lord Barrington, upon learning of the financial irregularities uncovered during the inquiry, withdrew his interest in the arrangement entirely, apparently unwilling to associate his family's name with the scandal now surrounding Alina's household, a development that Alina found she could not bring herself to regret in the slightest. When word of the resolved inquiry reached the town, the story that spread proved far less dramatic than the wild rumors that had circulated after the ball, though it carried its own quiet significance. Whispers now spoke of a stepmother's confession, a prince's protective intervention, and a young woman who had faced down secrets buried for years with more courage than anyone in the household had previously credited her with possessing. Beatrice, upon learning the full truth of what her mother had done, retreated into a subdued silence that lasted for several days, her earlier resentment toward Alina giving way to something more complicated, an uncomfortable reckoning with years of assumptions that had never held the solid ground she believed them to stand upon. Alina, meanwhile, found herself standing at the threshold of a life entirely different from anything she had imagined possible only weeks earlier. The truth of her past finally brought into the light, and the future stretching ahead of her wide open and uncertain in ways that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, genuinely hopeful rather than frightening. One quiet evening, several days after the inquiry concluded, Beatrice found Alina alone in the garden behind the house, sitting on the weathered bench where Alina often retreated when she needed space to think. Beatrice hesitated at the edge of the path, clearly uncertain of her welcome, before finally approaching and sitting down at the opposite end of the bench, leaving a careful distance between them. "I owe you an apology," Beatrice said, staring straight ahead rather than meeting Alina's eyes. "Several apologies, really, though I hardly know where to begin listing them." Alina studied her stepsister's profile, noting the genuine discomfort written across her features, so different from the sharp confidence Beatrice usually carried. "You do not have to do this," Alina said gently. "Not tonight, not if you are not ready." "I have been avoiding it for days," Beatrice admitted, "which I suppose tells you exactly how ready I am." She let out a short, humorless laugh, finally turning to look at Alina directly. "I spent years believing you had been given exactly what you deserved, nothing more, nothing less. It was easier than admitting that mother had wronged you, that the comfortable life Priya and I enjoyed came, in part, at the cost of yours." "You did not know the full truth," Alina said. "None of us did until recently." "Perhaps," Beatrice allowed, "but I knew enough to treat you unkindly regardless, and I chose to do so anyway, because it was simpler than questioning why our circumstances differed so sharply from yours. I am sorry for that, Alina." "Truly?" Alina considered her stepsister's words carefully, weighing years of accumulated hurt against the vulnerability now sitting beside her on the bench. Forgiveness did not arrive easily, nor did she believe it should, but she found, examining her own heart, that she no longer wished to carry the weight of old resentment forward into whatever came next. "I accept your apology," Alina said finally, "though I hope you understand it will take time before the years between us feel entirely healed. Apologies are a beginning, not an ending." "That is more grace than I expected," Beatrice said quietly, something like relief passing across her features. "More than I likely deserve if I am honest." "Perhaps," Alina said, allowing a small, genuine smile to soften her expression. "But I find I would rather extend grace than continue measuring exactly what everyone deserves. It makes for a lighter heart in the end." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, watching the sun sink slowly behind the garden wall, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and violet. It was not friendship, not yet, perhaps not for a long while still, but it was a foundation, fragile and new, upon which something better might eventually be built. Inside the house, Cordelia worked late into the evening at the kitchen table, poring over financial ledgers with a diligence Alina had never before witnessed from her, carefully tracking every expense and every step of the gradual repayment plan she had committed to honoring. It was slow, humbling work, stripped of the careful pride she had once worn like armor, but she pursued it without complaint, understanding perhaps for the first time in years that true security came not from guarded secrets, but from honest reckoning with the past. Priya, meanwhile, had taken to accompanying Alina on small errands into town, the two of them slowly rebuilding a connection that had been absent for most of their years living under the same roof. Their conversations remained careful at first, tentative, but grew steadily warmer with each passing day, small shared laughter gradually replacing the distance that had once defined their relationship. Alina watched these quiet transformations unfold around her with a sense of cautious wonder, hardly daring to trust that the household she had endured for so many years might genuinely be changing into something kinder, something closer to the family she had lost when her mother passed away so many years before. She did not know yet what the future held, whether her fragile new connection to Priya and Beatrice would deepen into something lasting, or whether old patterns might eventually reassert themselves once the shock of recent events faded. But for now, she allowed herself to hope, cautiously and carefully, that healing remained possible even after years of hurt, and that the truth, however painful in its arrival, had ultimately opened a door toward something far better than the silence that preceded it. And beyond the walls of that quietly healing household, in the palace across town, Adrian continued his own quiet work, ensuring that every promise he had made to Alina was honored fully, while also beginning, in careful conversations with his parents, to lay the groundwork for a future he hoped, with growing certainty, might include her permanently at his side. King Edward and Queen Isabel received the news of their son's growing attachment with more curiosity than concern, having heard the story of the ball and the garden reception through a dozen different sources long before Adrian ever worked up the courage to raise the subject formally at dinner one evening. Still, Adrian approached the conversation carefully, aware that a prince's choice of partner carried implications far beyond simple personal happiness. "Her circumstances are humble," he explained to his parents one evening, seated across from them in the smaller of the palace's two dining rooms, reserved for family meals away from the formality of state occasions. "She has faced considerable hardship, and only recently emerged from a difficult family situation involving financial mismanagement and a forced betrothal that has, thankfully, been resolved. I understand if such circumstances raise concerns about her suitability for a match of this significance." Queen Isabel set down her fork, studying her son with careful attention. "Adrian, do you love her?" The directness of the question caught him slightly off guard, though he did not hesitate long before answering. "I believe I do," he said, "more than I have felt for anyone I have met within the circles I am typically expected to move through. She is honest in a way few people around me manage to be. She does not flatter me, does not seek advantage from my position, and has shown more resilience facing genuine hardship than most nobles I know would manage facing far smaller difficulties." King Edward exchanged a brief glance with his wife, something knowing passing between them. "Your mother and I did not marry for political advantage either, whatever the histories might suggest," he said. "We married because we found in each other something worth building a life around. Character matters far more in the end than the circumstances someone was born into. If this young woman possesses the qualities you describe, I see no reason her humble beginnings should stand as an obstacle." "There will be those within the court who disagree," Queen Isabel added, though her tone carried more caution than disapproval. "You must be prepared for skepticism, perhaps even open criticism, should you choose to pursue this seriously. Not everyone will judge her as generously as your father and I are prepared to." "I am prepared for that," Adrian said firmly. "I would rather face criticism for choosing honestly than spend my life bound to someone chosen only for the sake of convenient alliance." His parents agreed in the end to meet Alina formally, and a private dinner was arranged the following week, far removed from the public spectacle of the ball or even the more intimate garden reception. Alina arrived at the palace that evening with nerves stretched taut, aware of the significance this meeting carried, though Adrian met her at the entrance himself, offering steady reassurance as he guided her toward the private dining room where his parents waited. "They will like you," he told her quietly just before they entered. "I have no doubt of that. Simply be yourself, exactly as you have been with me from the very beginning." The dinner proved far less intimidating than Alina had feared. Queen Isabel asked thoughtful questions about her mother, listening with genuine interest as Alina described the small kitchen where she had learned to bake, the gentle wisdom her mother had passed down before illness took her too soon. King Edward, for his part, seemed particularly impressed by Alina's account of the recent inquiry into her father's estate. The courage it had required to confront her stepmother directly rather than allowing old secrets to continue festering beneath the surface. "You handled a difficult situation with remarkable grace," the king observed, studying her with evident respect. "Many in your position might have sought harsh punishment for the wrongs done against them. You chose mercy instead, while still ensuring the truth came fully to light. That balance between justice and compassion is not easily achieved." "I did not wish to see my family destroyed," Alina said honestly. "Whatever mistakes were made, I believe most people deserve the chance to correct their wrongs rather than simply being punished for them." By the meal's conclusion, Alina could see genuine warmth reflected in both the king and queen's expressions, a warmth that eased much of the anxiety she had carried into the evening. As she and Adrian walked together through the palace gardens afterward, the summer night warm and fragrant around them, she felt, for the first time, a sense of true belonging within these grand walls that had once seemed so impossibly distant from her own small, humble life. "They approve of you," Adrian said, a note of quiet triumph in his voice as they walked slowly along the familiar garden paths. "I could see it clearly, watching them speak with you tonight." "I was terrified," Alina admitted, laughing softly with the relief of the evening finally settling over her. "I feared I would say something foolish, or that they would look at me and see only a servant girl who had somehow wandered too far above her proper station." "They saw exactly what I see," Adrian said, stopping beneath the same fountain where they had first spoken alone at the garden reception weeks earlier. "A young woman of remarkable strength and honesty, who has faced more hardship than most people twice her age, and emerged from it with her kindness fully intact rather than hardened into bitterness." Alina felt her heart swell with an emotion too large to easily name, watching the sincerity written plainly across his face in the soft evening light. "Adrian," she began, uncertain exactly what she meant to say next, only that the moment seemed to call for some acknowledgement of everything that had grown between them since that first chaotic night at the ball. He reached for her hand before she could find the right words, holding it gently between both of his own, the same gesture he had used weeks earlier in his private study, though it carried far greater weight now, layered with everything they had endured and overcome together since that difficult conversation. "I have known, almost from that very first evening, that you were someone extraordinary," he said quietly. "Not because of any story about rare fabric or foreign dye, but because of the quiet dignity you carried into a room full of people determined to make you feel small. I have watched that same strength carry you through every difficulty since, and I find myself, quite simply, unable to imagine my future without you standing beside me within it." Alina's breath caught, understanding the direction of his words even before he lowered himself carefully onto one knee beside the fountain, the water catching moonlight in soft, silver ripples behind him. "Alina Whitmore," he said, his voice steady despite the evident emotion behind it, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears gathered freely in Alina's eyes now, joy overwhelming the last remnants of nervous uncertainty that had followed her throughout the evening. She thought of her mother, of the quiet kitchen where she had once been taught that kindness mattered more than any title or fortune, and felt certain, with complete clarity, that her mother would have approved wholeheartedly of the man kneeling before her now, a man who valued her character above every convenient advantage his position might have afforded him instead. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with happy tears. "Yes, I would be honored." Adrian rose quickly, sweeping her into an embrace that lifted her briefly off her feet, both of them laughing with the sheer relief and joy of the moment, the fountain's gentle murmur the only witness to a promise that would soon become known throughout the entire kingdom. When he finally set her back down, he produced a small ring from his pocket, simple but elegant, its single stone catching the moonlight as he slid it carefully onto her finger. "It belonged to my grandmother," he explained. "She chose it herself, rather than accepting whatever grand jewel tradition suggested, because she believed true elegance needed no excessive decoration to prove its worth. I thought of her the moment I began searching for something to offer you. Alina studied the ring glowing softly on her hand, overwhelmed by the symbolism woven into its simple design, and found herself thinking, with quiet amusement, of the accidental stain that had started this entire remarkable journey. A spilled cup of tea, transformed by a clever prince's quick thinking into the beginning of a story neither of them could have possibly anticipated that chaotic evening. News of their engagement spread through the kingdom within days, carried on the same eager whispers that had once spread rumors of rare Eastern fabric and mysterious dyes. This time, however, the story required no embellishment to capture the public's imagination. A prince, choosing love and character over convenient advantage, had found his match in a young woman who had endured genuine hardship and emerged from it with her integrity fully intact. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates in the days following the announcement, eager for glimpses of the young woman whose story had captured the kingdom's collective heart, transforming almost overnight from a girl mocked for a simple stain into someone, celebrated for the very resilience that stain had first revealed. At the wedding, held several months later beneath a sky of brilliant autumn color, Alina wore a gown of pale gold silk, carefully chosen to complement rather than overshadow the simple elegance she had always carried naturally within herself. Mrs. Whitfield sat proudly among the honored guests, tears of genuine joy streaming freely down her weathered cheeks as she watched the young woman she had helped all those months ago walk down the aisle toward a future built on honesty, resilience, and love earned, rather than simply granted by fortunate circumstance. Beatrice and Priya stood among the wedding party as well, their relationship with Alina transformed almost beyond recognition from the cold distance that had once defined their years together. Cordelia, too, attended, standing quietly near the back of the gathered crowd, her expression a complicated mixture of pride and lingering guilt, though Alina had long since extended the forgiveness necessary to allow that particular wound to finally begin healing properly. As Alina walked down the aisle toward Adrian, who watched her approach with unguarded joy written plainly across his face, she thought once more of that chaotic, humiliating moment at the top of the palace stairs, the shawl slipping from her shoulders, the laughter of strangers ringing cruelly in her ears. She could never have imagined, standing there in that moment of pure shame, that the very thing meant to mark her as unworthy would instead become the beginning of everything that followed. A stain transformed, through one man's kindness and her own quiet courage, into the opening chapter of a life far richer and more joyful than she had ever dared to hope for. The wedding celebration continued long into the evening, music and laughter filling the palace grounds as guests from every corner of the kingdom gathered to celebrate the union everyone now spoke of, with genuine warmth rather than idle curiosity. Alina danced with Adrian beneath strings of lantern light, much like those that had illuminated their very first true conversation at the garden reception. Though this time no interruption came to threaten the moment, no lingering uncertainty shadowed the joy passing openly between them. Later that evening, as the celebration wound gently toward its close, Alina found a quiet moment to slip away toward the same fountain where Adrian had first knelt to propose, drawn by a need to simply breathe in the significance of everything that had unfolded since that chaotic night at the ball. She sat on the stone edge, listening to the water's gentle murmur, and allowed herself to reflect on the long path that had carried her from a small, gray room beneath the eaves to this moment of quiet, hard-won happiness. She thought of her mother often in moments like these, wishing she could share this joy with the woman who had first taught her that dignity could not be stripped away by circumstance alone, that kindness remained a choice available even in the hardest of times. She believed, with quiet certainty, that her mother would recognize in Adrian the same gentle strength she had always tried to instill in her daughter, and that recognition brought a peaceful comfort settling deep within Alina's chest. Adrian found her there a short while later, settling beside her on the fountain's edge without a word, simply taking her hand in his own as they both watched the moonlight dance across the rippling water. "You disappeared," he said softly, no accusation in his tone, only gentle curiosity. "I needed a moment," Alina admitted, "to remember everything that brought us here. It still feels, sometimes, like something too wonderful to be entirely real." "It is entirely real," Adrian said, squeezing her hand gently. "Every difficult moment, every challenge we faced together, led us honestly to this evening. I would not trade a single part of that journey, however painful certain portions of it proved to be, because each step taught me something new about the woman I chose to marry." Alina leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the water continue its gentle, endless motion beneath the moonlight. "What happens now?" she asked, though the question carried curiosity rather than worry, an easy comfort settling naturally into the simple act of imagining a shared future together. "Now," Adrian said, "we build a life together, one built on honesty rather than convenient appearance, on genuine partnership rather than simple obligation. We continue supporting your family as they rebuild what was broken. We work to ensure that no one else within this kingdom faces the kind of injustice you once endured, unseen and unheard by those who should have protected them. And we simply enjoy, whenever possible, the quiet happiness of two people who found each other despite every obstacle circumstance placed between them." Alina smiled, tilting her face up toward his, and found in his answering expression everything she had once believed impossible for someone in her circumstances to ever truly deserve. "That sounds," she said softly, "like exactly the life I would choose if given the choice all over again." "Then it is fortunate," Adrian said, leaning down to press a gentle kiss against her forehead, "that we have chosen it together." In the years that followed, Alina became known throughout the kingdom not simply as the princess who had once worn a stained dress to the royal ball, but as a woman who used her position to advocate tirelessly for families facing hardship similar to her own, establishing programs that helped widows and orphans navigate financial difficulties, without falling prey to the kind of desperate secrecy that had once nearly cost Alina her own future happiness. Cordelia, gradually rebuilding trust through years of honest effort, eventually became one of the program's most dedicated volunteers, finding in that work a measure of redemption for choices she had long regretted. Beatrice and Priya both married in the years that followed, their own unions built on foundations far more honest than the calculating ambitions that had once defined their youthful aspirations, having learned, through watching Alina's journey unfold, that genuine character mattered more than any advantageous match. The distance that had once separated the three stepsisters gradually gave way to a bond none of them could have predicted in those early years of quiet resentment and misunderstanding, proof that even the deepest wounds could heal when approached with patience and genuine willingness to change. And Alina herself, whenever she happened to spill tea or wine upon her own clothing during some formal occasion in the years that followed, found herself smiling rather than panicking, remembering always the night a simple accident had, through unexpected kindness and her own quiet resilience, opened the door to a life she had never dared to imagine possible for someone in her circumstances. The stain that once marked her for mockery had become, in the retelling of her own remarkable story, a symbol of the very qualities that had ultimately won her a prince's genuine devotion: honesty in the face of humiliation, dignity in the face of cruelty, and the quiet courage to remain exactly herself, even when the entire world seemed determined to convince her that who she was could never be enough. 5 years after her wedding, Alina stood before a gathering of the kingdom's council, a position few would have imagined possible for a girl once dismissed as unworthy of a single glance from anyone of importance. The council chamber, usually reserved for matters of trade and taxation, had been called into unusual session that morning to address a growing crisis among the kingdom's rural villages, where a series of poor harvests had left many families facing genuine hunger as winter approached. Adrian sat beside his father at the head of the long table, though it was Alina who had requested the floor, her voice steady despite the weight of the many skeptical eyes watching her closely. Several older council members had never fully embraced her presence within these formal proceedings, viewing her charitable work as admirable but ultimately separate from matters of genuine governance. A distinction Alina had grown quietly determined to challenge whenever the opportunity presented itself. "I have spent the past week visiting 3 of the affected villages personally," Alina said, unrolling a detailed map she had prepared with the help of local officials, marking each community struggling most severely beneath the harvest's failure. "What I found there was not simply hunger, though hunger is certainly present and urgent. I found families making impossible choices, selling what little remained of their livestock, pulling children from what education they could access, taking on debts to merchants that many will spend years struggling to repay, debts that mirror, in troubling ways, the very circumstances that once nearly destroyed my own family's future." A murmur passed through the assembled council members at this personal admission, though Alina continued without hesitation, having long ago decided that her own history, however humbling, served a genuine purpose when it helped illuminate the struggles of others facing similar hardship. "I propose," she continued, "establishing a formal grain reserve, funded jointly through the Crown's treasury and voluntary contributions from the kingdom's wealthier estates, to be distributed not as charity, but as low-interest loans repayable across several harvest seasons. This approach preserves the dignity of those receiving assistance, while ensuring the kingdom's most vulnerable families are not driven into the kind of desperate debt that so often leads to far greater and more lasting harm." Lord Halbrook, one of the council's most senior and traditionally minded members, cleared his throat with obvious skepticism. "Your Highness speaks passionately, but such a program would require significant coordination and oversight. Who among us has the experience necessary to manage something of this scale effectively?" "I do," Alina said simply, meeting his skeptical gaze directly without flinching. "I have spent 5 years building the very charitable networks capable of implementing exactly this kind of program, working directly with families across this kingdom who understand far better than any of us seated comfortably in this chamber what genuine hardship requires to overcome. I am not proposing something theoretical, Lord Halbrook. I am proposing something I have already begun building, brick by brick, village by village, for exactly this purpose." The chamber fell silent for a long moment, and Alina felt her heart pounding as she waited for some response, aware that the coming months for countless families hung, in some measure, upon the council's willingness to embrace this proposal rather than dismiss it as sentimental impracticality. It was King Edward, finally, who broke the silence. "I have watched my daughter by marriage build something remarkable these past 5 years," he said, pride evident in every word. "Transforming genuine hardship into genuine wisdom, and genuine wisdom into concrete action that has already improved countless lives throughout this kingdom. I trust her judgment in this matter completely, and I move that this council approve the program as she has outlined it." The vote that followed proved closer than Alina might have wished, several older members still hesitant to fully embrace a program championed so directly by someone whose own beginnings remained, in their minds, somewhat unconventional for a woman now shaping the kingdom's policy. But the measure passed, narrowly, and Alina felt tears of relief and quiet triumph gathering at the corners of her eyes as the council's decision was formally recorded. That evening, walking together through the same palace gardens where their story had first truly begun to deepen years earlier, Adrian squeezed her hand gently, pride evident in his warm expression. "You did something remarkable today," he said. "I do not think Lord Halbrook has been so thoroughly outmatched in council in all the years I have known him." Alina laughed, some of the day's tension finally easing from her shoulders. "I nearly lost my nerve, standing before all of them. It reminded me, oddly enough, of standing at the top of the palace stairs that very first night, feeling every eye in the room settle upon me with judgment I felt powerless to challenge." "And yet you did challenge it," Adrian said, "then and now in exactly the same way. With honesty and quiet, unshakable conviction." They paused near the same fountain that had witnessed so many significant moments of their shared history, and Alina found herself thinking, as she often did during quiet moments like these, of the long distance she had traveled since that chaotic evening when a spilled cup of tea had first set this entire remarkable journey into motion. She thought of her mother, of the lessons learned in a small, humble kitchen about dignity and kindness that no amount of mockery could ever fully strip away. She thought of Cordelia, now genuinely reformed through years of honest effort, and of Beatrice and Priya, whose relationships with her had grown into something she genuinely treasured rather than simply endured. Most of all, she thought of the small, frightened girl who had once believed a simple stain might define the entire shape of her worth in the eyes of a world quick to judge and slow to forgive, and felt a deep, quiet gratitude for everything that girl had endured and overcome to become the woman standing now beside the fountain, a princess whose greatest legacy was not her title or her wedding gown, but the countless families across the kingdom whose lives had been genuinely improved by her stubborn insistence that everyone, regardless of their circumstances at birth, deserved the chance to build something better for themselves. "Adrian," she said softly, watching moonlight ripple gently across the fountain's surface, "do you ever wonder what might have happened if the wind had not caught my shawl that night? If no one had ever seen the stain at all?" Adrian considered the question seriously, wrapping his arm gently around her shoulders as they stood together in comfortable silence for a long moment before answering. "I believe," he said finally, "that someone with your particular strength of character would have found her way to something remarkable eventually, stain or no stain, wind or no wind. Perhaps the path might have looked different, but I do not believe for a moment that the world could have kept someone like you hidden away forever, waiting quietly in the shadows for permission to shine." Alina smiled, leaning into his embrace, grateful beyond words for a love built not on chance alone, but on genuine recognition, patient understanding, and the quiet, steady partnership they had built together through every difficulty and triumph the years had brought their way. Whatever challenges still awaited them in the seasons ahead, she faced them now not with the fear of a girl once mocked for a simple accident, but with the steady confidence of a woman who had learned, through hardship and healing alike, that her true worth had never depended upon anyone else's judgment at all.